Okay, well, welcome back. Uh, Let me hang on here. Do a screen share. Almost forgot how to do my business here for a minute. There we go. There we go. Okay. Well, welcome back. Last week, had a little technical difficulty here at the township. Our internet went kaput for about 4 hours, so hopefully we won't have that interruption again today. Also, the weather has changed dramatically. It seemed like we go straight from summer to winter anymore. And I think we had maybe 2 weeks of fall. And now looks like it's about 20 degrees outside, overcast, supposed to have snow tonight. So who knows? Well, we are talking about the history of the Ozarks, and we are fast approaching the end of the Civil War. We're going to talk about some of it today, and then next week we're going to finish up the Civil War aspect of the Ozarks and move into something different, a period of time after the Civil War, which was a period of turmoil and rebirth, as I like to call it. But today we're going to look at the progress of the Civil War after the Battle of Wilson's Creek, primarily. So, our spotlighted Ozarker of the day is this young lady right here. I'm sure probably not very many people out there would recognize her, but this is Mary Phelps. She was the wife of John S. Phelps, who was the first congressman from the Springfield area and the Ozarks. And eventually he became, in the 1870s, the governor of Missouri. And he was a very wealthy man in Springfield at the time of the Civil War, volunteered, was made a brigadier general, was out into the campaign most of the 4 years. She stayed at home and manned the farm, as it was, south of Springfield, which is today Phelps Grove Park, which of course is in the interior of Springfield, if you're familiar with Springfield at all. So she is quite a person, and she plays a part in the events that happened immediately after the Battle of Wilson's Creek, as you'll see here in a minute. So we have seen how the Battle of Wilson's Creek ended, with the Southern forces victorious on the battlefield and the Northern forces, the Union forces, leaving the battlefield, returning to Springfield, and then abandoning the city, except for some of the hardy that stayed around, like Mary Phelps. General Lyon, of course, was killed on the Battle of Wilson's Creek. He is the first Union general killed in the Civil War. That's a big deal, and it was a big deal then for sure. It's not really talked about much anymore because the events of the Eastern campaigns with Gettysburg and all the big battles that we associate with the Civil War kind of overwhelmed the Battle of Wilson's Creek. But this was a really big event at the time, folks. And he was given a great acclaim by the Eastern press because of his heroic attitude and what he did on the battlefield. The body of General Lyon was actually left on the battlefield when the Union troops left. This was not unusual. They didn't have time to take care of the bodies. So it fell into the hands of the Confederate forces. Now, different day and age, they treated it with respect. They took it to the Ray House. Some of the medical people and some of the women that were operating as nurses washed the body, took care of. They posted a guard around it. And as soon as they could be notified, it was sent to Springfield, guarded by a Confederate force. They allowed it to come into Springfield with the body, leave the body with Mary Phelps, and in turn return back to its fellow Confederate soldiers. Dr. Melcher, who was a local doctor and ends up playing a part in the Civil War, as you'll see in a few minutes, had received permission to go out to the battlefield and take possession of it along with these Confederate troops and accompanied back into Springfield. As I said, it was taken to the John S. Phelps estate, and from there it was, basically cut into the spring house, which was a house that was always built around these farm areas where over a spring that they kept their perishable items. And obviously it was August, it was hot. They didn't want the body to decompose. So they kept it in the spring house until it could be removed safely and taken back to Connecticut. And again, it's a different day and age. Today, these things might not have occurred, but back in these days, there was a great deal of respect given to the enemy like this. And so he was regarded by a martyr. I mean, he was absolutely made a hero's return. This is the earliest photograph of the John S. Phelps estate that I could find. This is not the house where John S. Phelps lived. That's probably it looks more like a craftsman type house in the early 1900s. But this would have been the estate of John S. Phelps. This is where Lyon is buried back in Connecticut. And this is a memorial plaque to him. His train was draped in black. It stopped at all every train stop along the way, clear back to Connecticut, and crowds came out to give him a hero's worship. It was quite the deal. Like I said, much different than we remember him today, if he's remembered at all outside of this area here. This is the bed in the Ray House. Now, I understand today the actual bed is located in the museum now, and there is a replica bed in the Ray House. This is the bed that he actually was placed upon at the time. My understanding is once they made Wilson's Creek National Park, one of the descendants of the Ray family came to the park and told him, "Hey, I actually have the bed that John Ray's family owned and that General Lyon's body was placed in." And she gave the bed up to the national park willingly as a memorial. So what happens to Springfield? The Union abandons it. As it turns out, Springfield is going to go back and forth for the next year and a half. The Confederates will go into Springfield, take charge, and then they will abandon it. The Union will come back. They will abandon it again. The Confederates will come back. And then they'll abandon it again, and finally the Union will come back and remain in control. But it goes back and forth about 3 or 4 different times over the next year and a half. Early Sunday morning, the day after the Battle of Wilson's Creek, Sturgis, who's now in command of the Union forces, makes a full retreat back to Rolla. Most of the Union sympathizers in Springfield accompanied him, and they said that there was a wagon train over 3 miles long leaving the city that Sunday. They also took with them $2 million in gold bullion. Springfield it wasn't a very big town, but it must have had some money because this was a lot of gold back in those days. Obviously, if the South would have got there, they would have, been able to seize that, but they didn't at that time. Monday, August 12th, McCulloch and the Confederate forces enter Springfield. They foraged, they seized the Union property owners, and they released the Confederates, the sympathizers, the slaves and freedmen were forced to join the Confederate Army, not as soldiers. They would not have fought at this time, although later in the war, they did fight on both sides, obviously more so on the Union side than the Confederate side, but they were forced into the manual labor type acts that were required, like cutting wood, and the women would have been the laundry women, things like this. So what were the results of the Battle of Wilson's Creek? Well, it can be called a Pyrrhic victory. A Pyrrhic victory is one in which the casualties were so high that they were unable to really parlay their victory into a real victory. They did not take advantage of it. The result was they didn't really get much out of it. It's kind of like if you watched the Chiefs game yesterday, right off the bat, the opposing team made an onside kick and recovered the ball, and they drove all the way down the field only to get nothing out of it. It was as a result, it's kind of like a Pyrrhic victory for the other team. in that particular series of plays. That's what happened here. The South won the battle, but they didn't get much out of it because they failed to pursue their victory. Casualties at the Battle of Wilson's Creek were extremely high. Now, true, it was not a big battle like Gettysburg or some of the other, like the Battle of the Wilderness or some of the really large battles of the Civil War. But percentage-wise, it had amongst the highest casualty rates of almost any battle in the Civil War. The Union casualties were 24%, almost 1/4 of all the soldiers that fought on the Union side were casualties. That means that 258 of them were killed, 873 of them were wounded. And you got to remember, folks, at this day and age, if you're wounded on the battlefield, there's a good chance you're going to die. It's not like it is today, where if you're wounded, they have all these medical facilities and they can, airlift you out and all. If you were wounded, unless you were just, if you were lucky, you got wounded in an arm or a leg, and they chopped it off. If you got wounded in the head or on the torso, you were probably gone. That's just all there is to it. It was not, not a good war in that regard. The Confederate casualties were lower percentage-wise, but actually about the same as far as actual numbers. Remember, they outnumbered the Union about 2-1. So they were only like 12%, but again, they had actually more people killed and more people wounded than did the Union forces. Most of the wounded, as I said, died because the medical conditions weren't good. They couldn't bury them. Again, unless you're familiar with the Ozarks, digging graves in the Ozarks is not something that is easy to do. And you're talking here a good 500 soldiers that needed to be buried immediately. Well, folks, there's no way that could be done. You can dig about an inch of topsoil in the Ozarks, and particularly out at the Battle of Wilson's Creek area. It's solid bedrock under about 2 inches of topsoil. So as a result, what they did, they threw them in sinkholes, these natural occurring sinkholes that just dot the Ozarks, thousands of them all over the place. And so they threw them in the sinkholes until they were later able to be dug up and retrieved. And after the war, they buried the remains of these soldiers as well as they could at a new national cemetery that was built in Springfield, Missouri. This is the most famous of the sinkholes. Now, you got to realize that this was a lot deeper then. It's been filled in. This thing may have been 40, 50 foot deep at that time. These sinkholes were huge back in these days. And it's said that for years afterward, people were still going out and digging up around these sinkholes, finding memorabilia, belt buckles, canteens, muskets, probably parts of bodies. I hate to be gross, but they were digging up and finding things continually out of these sinkholes at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. This is a view of the National Cemetery that was built in 1867 in Springfield, Missouri. It's quite an unusual cemetery. If you've never been there, it's pretty huge, obviously. You'll notice back here, there is a rock wall. There was a wall built between the Union graves and the Confederate graves because they buried both in the National Cemetery, but they separated them with a wall. On the 50th anniversary, 1911, of the Battle of Wilson's Creek, they broke through that wall and joined the two forces together. It is the first national cemetery where that occurred. Also, this is a couple of photographs of the graves. You will notice that the Union graves, the Union tombstones are rounded. The Confederate gravestones are peaked. If you've ever at a national cemetery where there's both Confederate and Union soldiers buried, you will notice this, that the peaked ones are the Confederates, the rounded ones, and today the tombstones for military forces are still rounded like this. There's an old urban legend that the reason that they were peaked was that after the war, the Union soldiers would come and sit on the Confederate graves, and people got upset about that, so they started putting peaks on the tombstones. I don't think that's true, but that's an urban legend that has gone around. So, some interesting facts about the Battle of Wilson's Creek. There were 5 Union soldiers that won the Congressional Medal of Honor at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Nicholas Bouquet, Lorenzo Emil, John Schofield, William Wherry, and Lieutenant Henry Wood. I often wondered if Henry Wood was kin to Leonard Wood. Again, if you're familiar with the Southwest Missouri, the Ozarks area, you know that we have a huge Army post in Southwest Missouri called Fort Leonard Wood. He was a general in the Spanish-American War, but he was not kin to Leonard Wood. There were 14 graduates of West Point that saw action at the Battle of Wilson's Creek on both sides. General Price, the head of the Missouri militia that fought against General Lyon, was also wounded at the battle. It's said that he often remarked that he was had he not been so big, he wouldn't have been wounded. That it wasn't fair because he was kind of rotund. That's a nice way of putting it, right? Several men who would gain notoriety after the war as Old West characters were at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Wild Bill Hickok was there. William Clark Quantrell, Frank James, not Jesse. Jesse was still too young. He was only about 15, and he was still back home on the farm. Bloody Bill Anderson, Cole Younger, all these were present at the Battle of Wilson's Creek, amongst others. I believe Belle Starr's husband was there. Franklin Armstrong fought at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. He had also fought at the Battle of Bull Run, the first battle of the Civil War. Remember, Wilson's Creek's the second major battle of the Civil War. The difference is when he fought at the Battle of Bull Run, he fought on the Union side. When he fought at the Battle of Wilson's Creek, he'd switch sides to the Confederate side. Kind of an unusual thing. And finally, there's Pegleg Pete. The story goes, and as far as I can find, it's a true story, that as the Union forces were leaving the battlefield, one of the last men on the troops, a man by the name of Pete, and I don't know what his last name is, but there was a cannonball that landed near him. Now, you got to remember, these cannonballs have timed fuses, but it didn't go off. And so he thought he'd be smart and kick the thing back down the hill to the Confederate forces. So he put his foot on it to kick it down the hill, and it blew off his leg. The thing of it was, ever after that, every year they would have a big celebration after the Civil War. They had a thing called the Grand Army of the Republic, and they would celebrate. They would have reunions every year, and they said that Pegleg Pete would be the man that they would all hold up and take a drink to, and that he was quite the hero because he was the last man wounded at the Battle of Wilson's Creek and had lost a leg. Not humorous at all, but in retrospect, it's a little humorous. Price and McCulloch occupy Springfield at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. After the battle, the next day, Monday, August 12, 1861, the Confederate forces enter Springfield. They take over the city. They appoint Dick Campbell as commander of the Confederate Home Guard. He's kind of put in charge of the town of Springfield. Of course, again, if you're familiar with Springfield at all, you know the Campbell family is huge. John Pope Campbell was the founder of Springfield, and one of the major thoroughfares of Springfield that runs north-south is Campbell Avenue. Again, in this day and age of canceling people out, I'm surprised they haven't been a petition up to change the names of Campbell Avenue. Things are just kind of crazy like that anymore. Union sympathizers were imprisoned, foraging and slaves and freemen forced into service, as I said. However, McCulloch and Price got into a big argument. They already didn't get along. Now they really got into an argument because McCulloch wanted to just stay in Springfield. Price said, let's chase after the enemy. We've got them on the run. Let's go get them. And McCulloch said, no, I'm not going to do that. We're staying here. We're too beat up. We've got to refurnish our ammunition. We got to heal our sick and wounded. And Price finally said, that's it. I've had enough. And he took off on his own. He separated from McCulloch and took off and tried to wage a fall offensive against the Union forces in Missouri. He wasn't quite successful, as you'll see. Dick Campbell, that's a photograph of he and his wife. He was placed in charge of the Confederate Home Guards. So McCulloch and Price. Price leaves Springfield. He goes straight up to central Missouri, to the town of Lexington, Missouri, which at that time was a very important town on the Missouri River. And he has a huge battle there, a 3-day battle called the Battle of the Hemp Bales, usually called the Battle of the Hay Bales, because they didn't want to be associated with hemp, because back in those days, back when they were naming these things, hemp was considered not good. Of course, hemp is just a type of cannabis that they used to make ropes out of, which was a big deal back in these days. And it doesn't have the active ingredient that marijuana has. Not that it didn't make any difference, because last week, Missouri and all their intelligence voted to legalize marijuana. It's recreational in the state. I don't even want to go there. I have certain opinions about that. McCulloch, meanwhile, decides Springfield was indefensible. He looked around. He said, man, this place can't be defended. What was I thinking? Why did I even want this town? It's on a flat plain. There's no natural defenses. I'm not staying. So while Price leaves and goes north trying to take the battle to the Union, McCulloch retreats south into northern Arkansas, where it's much easier to defend down in the hills and the mountains. General Price reluctantly rejoins him after Lexington, because he realizes he's not got the manpower needed to seize Missouri for the Union, for the Confederacy. So they join back together. Now, remember, the main Union commander sitting in Springfield, St. Louis, man by the name of General John C. Fremont. John C. Fremont is the commander of the Army of the West. Big army, 20, 30, 35,000 soldiers in St. Louis. He is told by Abraham Lincoln specifically, get off your rear end, go get the Confederates. There's no danger to St. Louis. Nobody's coming to St. Louis. Go chase the Confederates out of Missouri. We need to save the state for the Union. So Fremont reluctantly moves south, kind of like a snail. He just went very, very slowly. He finally reaches. This is a remnant of the Battle of Lexington that Price waged in his offensive there. You can see there's a cannonball still wedged in the courthouse columns. You can see that. It's a big deal as you drive down the highway in Lexington. They've got this mark there, the Battle of Lexington, with the cannonball still embedded in the column. So, as I said, McCulloch has left Springfield. Fremont is ordered to move south and seize the city of Springfield as a base, so he can later be ordered to launch an offensive into Arkansas. So he has this huge army, 30,000 troops, moves like a snail southward. Finally ends up in Bolivar, Missouri. And he finds out that McCulloch has left the city. So he sends his bodyguard unit, about 300 troops, led by a man by the name of Charles Zagoni, to head south and seize Springfield in what's generally called the First Battle of Springfield. It really wasn't a battle. There was only Dick Campbell's home guards there, and they weren't capable of putting up much of a battle. So Zagoni races down to Springfield, regains control of it. In the meantime, Lincoln is so furious with Fremont because Fremont is just, it's like he doesn't want to fight. And he says, I've had enough of this guy. I know he's a hero. I know he was a big man in the old West. I know he was the presidential candidate of the Republican Party in 1856. But, I've had enough of this guy. And he fires him. Huge deal, folks. I'm telling you, back in those days, that was a big deal. It would be kind of like Biden firing his vice president today. It was a big deal. And so anyway, Fremont is fired, and David Hunter is placed in command of the troops. He comes to Springfield with this huge army. He looks around and says, what were we thinking? There's nothing here. It's indefensible. He reaches the same conclusion that McCulloch reached. And so he abandoned Springfield. He wired back and says, folks, there's nothing here. We can't fight from here. It's indefensible. There's not enough resources. We've got to get back closer to our supply lines. And so he is ordered to retreat from Springfield after all this hullabaloo about getting Springfield. McCulloch, once he hears that the Union has abandoned it, says, well, fine, I'll just go back up into Springfield then. And so he reoccupies Springfield. Like I said, it goes back and forth for about a year and a half. McCulloch's army goes back and he winters in Springfield. Remember, folks, in this day and time, they called recess kind of, at least the first couple of years of the Civil War. When winter came on, everybody went to their respective camps and kind of just camped in. There wasn't a lot of winter fighting. That changes about halfway through the Civil War with Ulysses S. Grant. But now, for this time, both sides kind of take a recess and kind of like a halftime. And they winter in Springfield until the spring campaign. This is Colonel Zagoni. And this is a marker commemorating his, it's called Zagoni's Raid. And it was, it was a big deal back in those days because he did it so lightning fast. And he won against overwhelming numbers and re-seized Springfield. Most people didn't even know where this marker is. It's in a very obscure location in the city of Springfield. So that's spring. What happens next? Well, spring comes. Now the Union Army decides they're going to march back south and they're going to engage the Confederates. McCulloch, spring is coming on. He once again abandoned Springfield, and it is reoccupied now by the Union forces, never to be unoccupied again, as you'll see. He retreats back into northern Arkansas around an area called Pea Ridge. And this is where the biggest battle of the Trans-Mississippi West occurs in the spring of 1862, actually March 6th to the 8th. It was a big 3-day battle. It was much bigger than the Battle of Wilson's Creek. And it is generally accepted as the most important battle of the Civil War in the Ozarks because it kind of saved the Ozarks for the Union and saved the state of Missouri and basically ended major military operations west of the Mississippi River. There were no more big battles west of the Mississippi River after Pea Ridge. There were battles, but they were relatively small. And there was never really any threat that Missouri was going to be seized for the Confederacy. And remember, we talked a couple of weeks ago how important Missouri was for both sides. So the Battle of Pea Ridge occurs. The Union Army is now charged and headed by Samuel Curtis. He occupies Springfield and then he marches south with an army of about 10,500 soldiers. Now, remember, McCulloch and Price, the Confederates, are fighting, and they haven't made up. They're still fighting. Finally, the Confederate government said, we got to get control of this thing. We got to have a unified army. So they send a man down by the name of General Earl Van Dorn, who is placed in charge of this fractured Southern Army in Northwest Arkansas. By the way, they make up over 24,000 troops. As you can see, they outnumber the Union forces 2.5 to 1. I mean, it's a gigantic army. That's a really big army, folks. And so, anyway, they get into this battle around Elkhorn Tavern. Remember, there's always two names for most Civil War battles. There's the Union name, which generally is named after a geographical, something like a mountain or a river or something. In this case, they call it Pea Ridge. And then there's a Southern name, which generally is named after the nearest town, village, whatever. In this case, Elkhorn Tavern. So it rages around this Pea Ridge Elkhorn Tavern area for 3 days. It's a big battle, folks. And even though the Union forces are outnumbered 2.5 to 1, they are much better organized, and they are much more efficient. They're much more. They have better supplies. They have better supply lines. And the Southern Army is just kind of in disarray. On top of that, they lost a great number of their leaders. General McCulloch is killed by a sniper. For decades, it was thought it was Wild Bill Hickok that killed him. That was the legend that grew up. It was not Wild Bill Hickok. He did not kill General McCulloch. 3 other Southern generals were killed or captured. It ended up destroying their leadership forces. The Union ultimately wins the battle. And again, folks, this is a gigantic battle, and it's very important because it does save Missouri for the Union side, and that's a big plus. It gives the Union control of the Mississippi River. It gives the Union control of the Missouri River. It gives the Union basically control of the Ohio River, which are the 3 major river routes throughout the United States. So it was a gigantic win for the Union Army. Now, at this point, the Confederates changed their tactics in Missouri and Arkansas. They realized they are no longer in a position to wage big frontal assaults. So they changed their whole tactics. After the Battle of Pea Ridge and the subsequent defeat at Prairie Grove, Arkansas, which occurred later on that fall, they changed from these full frontal assault battles to surgical strike type things, led by cavalry units. Probably nobody is more famous for this than a man by the name of General Joe Shelby. He had something he called his Iron Brigade. And during 1863, he made a charge up into Missouri and basically destroyed parts of Missouri. It said that he rode around Missouri. That's what it says. He traveled 1,500 miles. He had over 1,000 casualties on Union forces and captured or destroyed over an estimated $2 million worth of supplies and property. I mean, this was the kind of thing that the Confederates decided they were going to do now. Tear up railroad lines, cut telegraph wires, burn mills, surgical strikes kind of type things. And then after that, it developed into a full-fledged guerrilla war. And it was just a horrible situation in the Ozarks. After the Battle of Springfield, which occurs in the winter of 1863, the Ozarks descends into a total guerrilla warfare type situation where both sides just waged war on the civilian population, what was left of it. And we're going to see this next week. It was just a terrible, terrible situation. The worst guerrilla warfare of the Civil War was fought in the Ozarks. And that's kind of what we're noted for. Nothing to be noted for, but that's what we are. This is kind of Joe Shelby's raid. You can see he came up to Pineville, Neosho, Humansville, Warsaw, Cocamp, Tipton, Marshall, over to Waverly, which happened to be his hometown before the Civil War, and back down to Carthage and back down to Arkansas, and just laid waste to the western part and the southwestern part of Missouri on this raid. This became the Southern tactics rather than full-fledged assaults with large armies, surgical strike type things. Now, what happened the next 3 years? Well, I kind of just have already told you, the remainder of the Civil War in Missouri consisted mostly of small skirmishes, battles, guerrilla warfare. There were battles in the Ozarks and in Missouri, but they were small ones. Look at this list. Springfield had a pretty good sized battle, and then you've got all these smaller towns. Neosho, there were 9 battles of Neosho in the Civil War, 9 different battles. Osceola was a huge battle, very important. And you'll find out about it next week. City of Bolivar had a battle. Newtonia, down in the very southwestern part of the Ozarks, had 2 big battles. Marshfield, West Plains, Mountain Grove, Salem, Cassville, Ozark, Mount Vernon, Hartville. These are just some of them. There were other ones, but these are some of the bigger battles. And when I say bigger, I'm only talking maybe 1,000 troops on both sides, not a lot. So you didn't have anything near the size of Wilson's Creek or the Battle of Pea Ridge. And again, here's a kind of a map of Missouri that kind of shows you where the big battles took place. There's Newtonia, there's Carthage, Wilson's Creek, Springfield, New Madrid, a little town called Belmont, Cape Girardeau, Fredericktown, Pilot Knob. Here's the Camp Jackson, which occurred right at the beginning of the war, Boonville, Glasgow, Lexington, and one of the last battles of the Civil War was fought at Westport, the Battle of Westport, which is now Kansas City. There were also a couple of brief battles up in the northeastern part. I don't know much about them. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm really not for sure what happened in either one of these battles. Finally, the last thing I want to talk to you about today is the final defense of Springfield. After Pea Ridge, as I've showed you, that the tactics changed. And, the South basically decided to do these surgical strikes. Their target once again became Springfield in southwest Missouri, because Springfield had now been occupied by the Union forces and they were there to stay. They made it a supply depot. They made it a medical center. It became the main hub of the Union forces in the southern part of Missouri. So it was decided by the Confederates that they were going to send up a cavalry unit to try to harass Springfield. They didn't have any idea they were going to take it over or anything. They just wanted to go up and burn things and destroy things. Springfield was under the command of a man by the name of Egbert Brown. He was a brigadier general, and he was placed in charge of the forces. Most of the forces there were, by the way, were home guards, enrolled Missouri militia, is what they were called. And they were basically like National Guard units. There were some Union soldiers, but they weren't a lot. Now, he did try to at least defend Springfield. He knew that Springfield, just like everybody else that had seen it, knew it was kind of indefensible because there weren't any natural defenses. So he built what he called forts. He built 5 earthen forts around the city. And again, I'm going to show you a picture of one of these, and you'll see it's not much, but at least it was something. These 5 forts, they no longer exist, obviously. But if you're familiar with Springfield, you'll maybe recognize these places. One of them was around Kansas Expressway in Nettleton, which is out towards the airport on the northwest side of Springfield. There was one at Walnut and Fort Streets, which today is right off the square. There was one at Fort and Old Wire Road, which is basically Sunshine in Fort. There was one around South Street and Mount Vernon Streets, which is like 2 blocks south of the square, and one right to the east of the square at St. Louis and Dawson Streets. And again, these no longer exist, but he built these forts to defend Springfield. Now, this is kind of a crude map of Springfield. You can see this is the square at Springfield. And this is Boonville Street, which was named because it headed towards Boonville. This is St. Louis Street because it headed towards St. Louis. This is College Street because there was a college on it. Okay. This is Mount Vernon Street because it headed towards the little town of Mount Vernon. and this is South Street because it headed south. There was also a road to Ozark, which is now primarily what we would call 65 South. And there's the Old Wire Road, which is now primarily Sunshine down to about halfway till you get to Republic. So this was Springfield, folks. Springfield was not a big city. The Phelps Farm was down in this area right through here. So there wasn't, this was out of the city. And so this is where the forts were. Here was one, there was one here, there was one here, there was one here, and there was one here. This was what the forts would have looked like. They weren't really so much forts as they were entrenchments to keep the cavalry units from charging into the city. They were ditches that were dug, and then they would put up sharpened stakes to keep the horses and the men from crossing over them. They were placed at strategic locations. The problem is you can go around them, but it was a good effort. The only fort that you could really call a fort was the big one out by the airport. And this is where all the supplies were kept for the Union Army. And it actually was about several hundred feet in circumference. And it had 5 different, what they called bastions at the corners. And this is one of the remaining bastions that was still stood in the 1950s. And it was had been made into a log. It was a log structure and had been made into a house, as you can see. It no longer exists, but this was one of the bastions from this fort that stood out by the airport. That gives you some idea of the encampments. Now, the Southern forces issue a command to a man by the name of General Marmaduke to head north to do his raiding in southwest Missouri. He is not ordered to attack Springfield. He decides to do that on his own. He has a force of about 2,000, although Brown understands he has a force of about 6,000. And he's scared to death, folks, because he thought 6,000 soldiers on cavalry, I can't fight that. As it was, he was still outnumbered with 2,000, but at least he's got a fighting chance. They call everybody in from the surrounding communities. They say, hey, they're headed this way. We got to get ready to fight them. They even some of the wounded, remember Springfield's a medical hospital now, and some of the wounded are activated, the ones that can walk. It's called the Quinine Brigade. And they man these forts and positions, and they get ready to fight. Marmaduke's army, January 7th, 1863, attacks Ozark, burns it to the ground, burns the courthouse, burns the mill, not the one that Johnny Morris just reactivated, but another one. And they head north to Springfield. Here is Brown, and here's the Confederate cavalry head, Marmaduke. By the way, Marmaduke later on becomes the governor of Missouri. He is, he's a, basically he's becomes involved with politics in the state of Missouri after the Civil War and is elected governor. The Battle of Springfield occurs on January 8th, 1863. Basically, it was a cavalry charge upon the city. It was repulsed time and time again. They tried to attack this fort number 1, and they can't break into it because it's too big. It's got cannon there. Marmaduke then begins firing upon the city with his cannon, which was considered kind of an uncivil type thing. And Brown lodged a protest saying, this wasn't right. And then it devolves into hand-to-hand urban combat. You don't see this very much in the Civil War. Most Civil War battles are fought out in the open. This battle was fought right downtown. There were troops firing behind tombstones, out of building windows at each other, close combat. It's kind of an unusual type battle. By the way, one of the defenders, I just found this out a couple of weeks ago when doing research about the Battle of Springfield, a man by the name of William Washington Stevenson. He was the first cousin of my great-grandfather Jacob. I did not know he fought in this battle until I was researching it, and found out that he had fought in the battle, ended up being wounded. He later on he joins the Union Army. He is one of these home guards, and he and his brother were killed a month apart at the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee, in 1864. Colonel Brown himself is wounded, but they are able to hold off the Southern forces. And Marmaduke is forced to retreat to Hartville. And back to the south, he has a big battle at Hartville, which rages and becomes a pretty good sized battle. This is a photograph of the Union troops on the square that was taken prior to the attack. I don't know where this photograph came from. I don't know who took it, but it shows you some of the Union troops lined up, preparing to do battle. So from this point on, the battle, the war in Missouri devolves into guerrilla warfare. And it is horrible, folks. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to talk about the guerrilla warfare that took place and in the Ozarks, and it's just not good. I'm telling you that. So I appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something. And I will be back with you hopefully next week if the internet stays up. So